Good day. It is time for our Week 10 reading summary. We are making our way toward the Promised Land. And in this week's reading, we conclude the complete reading of the consolidated laws of Moses. And again, remember that our editor has consolidated the laws as presented in Exodus, in Deuteronomy, and Leviticus, all into this one section. And just to make sure we understand where we are at the end of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And the entire law is apparently being presented once again. If we could look at the map here briefly, so what has transpired is that they went to Kadesh Barnea, they sent the spies, and then they were afraid to go, but then they decided to try to go, but God was not with them because he was angry that they didn't trust him. And so that was the start of the 40 years of wandering. That's why in this little book I have, it's just showing this big loop. Nobody knows where they went. What we do know is we know they went through Machaloth near the end of the 40 years. Now, nobody really knows where that is. And we do know that they went down to the head of this gulf, the Gulf of Aqaba, because they went through Ezion Geber. So after that, remember they were rebuffed by Edom, and that brings up an important point. I indicated incorrectly that was related to the Ishmaelites. Not true. It was a brother, but that Ishmael was the brother of Isaac. It was Jacob's brother, Esau, who was the progenitor of the Edomites. The Ishmaelites are believed to be the people who moved down into the Arabian Peninsula. Incidentally, one of our astute readers figured out that I had that wrong, and I appreciate that feedback. They're all brothers. Anyway, so what they did is they had to kind of go around Edom. This author, the author of this map, believes that they went out into the Negev, the desert, so they would not pass through Edom and start a fight with Edom. That's a common understanding. It could otherwise be that they went around to the east. I don't think there's any way to know. And keep in mind, at this point, they have already had a fight with the Moabites and the Ammonites. So all that has transpired, and now they are waiting patiently to cross the Jordan River to Jericho. And recognize that all of this rereading of the law, reestablishing the covenant between God and the Israelites is taking place at that location at the end of the 40 years of wandering. Just a few of my favorite of the commands that are reiterated in our current reading. I'm touched by the gleanings being saved for the poor and strangers. That's interesting and somewhat consistent with Arabic teachings as well. Helping the poor, that is much less common throughout the world at this point. And of course, a couple of my favorites, respect for parents is commanded in these Levitically reproduced laws and is one of the 10 commandments. And of course, my personal favorite, Leviticus 19:32. I've grown into loving this one. Show respect for the elderly. I will concede that there were probably times in my life when I didn't go so much for that one. And then another favorite of mine is the fact that they are commanded to care for the widows and orphans. And I like our editor's summary, which I will read very briefly. You can probably see it on screen, but you don't need to. You can read it yourself. This is the March 5th reading. One feature of the laws of Moses which sets them apart from the laws of non-theocratic nations is the attention given to the protection of the weak, the poor, and the stranger. For example, a common provision throughout the code is that for the most part, each law is applicable to citizens and non-citizens alike. There is in this a reminder that the Israelites themselves were once persecuted as foreigners in the land of Egypt. In addition to the general principles of fairness and equal protection found throughout all the laws, there are various specific laws calling for acts of benevolence, special respect for particular persons, did I mention elderly people, and care for human and animal life. So that is kind of the end of the summary of the laws. Now, I would note to you that there are also given in this section rules of warfare. And what I found quite interesting is that in general, for most situations, the Israelites are to make an offer of peace. And then if they accept it, then there's to be they're to be the subjects of the Israelites. But for the Canaanites or Amorite cities, commanded to be completely destroyed. The command is they are to completely destroy them and their inhabitants. Deuteronomy 29:1 states, "These are the terms of the covenant the Lord commanded Moses to make with the Israelites in Moab, in addition to the covenant he made with them at Horeb." And we have read everything that was commanded at Horeb and at Moab, all in the same reading. Actually, been the last 2 weeks, basically. Then, quite interestingly, while we're at Moab, Moses commands that every Sabbath year, the law is to be read again. Isn't that interesting? That is found on the, let me get that right, March 6th reading. So Moses wrote down this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. Then Moses commanded them, this is in quotes, of course there were no quotations in the original text, but this is the command. At the end of every 7 years, in the year for canceling debts, during the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he shall choose, you shall read this law before them in their hearing. So Moses commanded that to every person in Israel, and happily we are engaging in reading that law ourselves. This renewing of the covenant before entering the promised land of Canaan occurs here on the east side of the Jordan. So we're now preparing to enter the promised land. Moses dies. He is buried by God. And it specifically says nobody knows where he was buried, but it was clearly in Moab. I believe the people in Jordan claim it was at Mount Nebo, but I don't know if that's accurate or not. And at that point, Joshua, and before his death, of course, before Moses' death, they were summoned to the tent of meeting, and the mantle of command was passed to Joshua, and God gave Joshua instructions. And Joshua then sent the spies within our current reading to Jericho, which would be the first city they were going to attempt to conquer. And this is, of course, a famous story. We won't waste time going through all the details. We know about Joshua at the Battle of Jericho. But I would note to you this very interesting event in which the spies, what would I say, take shelter with a woman of ill repute in the city of Jericho, famous name Rahab we usually pronounce it. And what's fascinating is that this woman seems to be completely aware of God's promise to the Israelites. She certainly seems aware of the history of what has happened in the last 40 years, the fact that Egypt was destroyed, the Ammonites were destroyed. She knows all this, and she wants to be saved. And as a result of her faith in this fact, she becomes one of the progenitors of Jesus himself. She is in the line of the people that led to Jesus. And again, just like in the crossing of the Red Sea, another miracle is performed to help. We don't know exactly how many, but all of the soldiers are proceeding across the Jordan River. Now, that doesn't mean all 630,000, but because the wives and children of the Gadites, Reubenites, and the eastern half of the tribe of Manasseh are staying behind on the east side of the Jordan. But all the rest of the people, apparently including women and children, cross the Jordan River when God piles up the water upstream and they are allowed to cross freely across the Jordan River. This is kind of like bookends on the wandering in the wilderness. The crossing of the Red Sea is miraculous and begins their wilderness wandering. The crossing of the Jordan is miraculous and begins their enjoyment of the promised land. The parallels to our own birth and death should be sort of obvious. Remind yourself that 12 stones were taken from the river and used to set up an altar at Gilgal. So we won't go through the details of marching around Jericho, but ultimately the walls fall. Again, apparently miraculously, although could be physical explanations. Tramping around the base of the walls weakened them. I don't know. The fact is, the walls fall, Jericho is destroyed, and Rahab is saved. So the reading of the laws is over, and the conquest of the promised land has become. We look forward to reading about that in the coming week, and we're glad you were here to join us this afternoon or evening or morning. Thank you.